I've never been the type to worry. When you're with a cop, you get used to late nights, unanswered texts, and the quiet dread that knots in your stomach when the news reports something bad happening in town. But that night was different. It started with a simple call, a noise complaint at the old house on the edge of town. I remember watching my partner lace up their boots, grabbing their belt and keys, moving with the kind of tired efficiency that came with years on the force. Nothing unusual, just another shift. A quick peck on the cheek, a brief glance at the clock, and then the front door closing behind them. The house had a reputation, of course. Every small town has one of those. A place kids dare each other to run past. A house spoken about in half whispers at the local diner. It had been empty for years, ever since the last owners just left. No moving trucks, no foreclosure notices. One day they were there, and the next, the place sat still and hollow. The town let rot. The windows grew cloudy with dust. The paint curled back from the wood, and vines clawed their way up the porch columns like skeletal fingers. Nobody went inside. Not until that night. The neighbors, an older couple who still believed in baking pies for newcomers, had been the ones to call. They had dismissed the sounds at first. A tree branch tapping against the window, the old pipes creaking as the temperature dropped. But then came the scraping, the slow drag of something heavy against the floor. Tapping, but not rhythmic. Erratic like fingernails drumming against wood. And, faintly, in the dead silence of midnight, something that almost sounded like whispering. They told themselves it was nothing. The wind, the house settling, the paranoia that comes with too many horror movies on an empty street. But then, around 2 a.m., they remembered the house was supposed to be empty. My partner and their partner on duty, 2 officers, seasoned enough not to be rattled by things like strange noises, arrived at the scene. Their patrol car pulled up, headlights cutting through the thick fog that had settled low to the ground. They stepped out, radios clipped to their vests, flashlights in hand. The house loomed, a hulking silhouette against the moonlight, its windows dark and vacant. They knocked. No answer. Another knock. The quiet stretched. The porch creaked under their weight. They reached for the knob. Locked, of course. But as they turned away, the door moved. Just a crack. A whisper of movement, so slow and deliberate it could have been a trick of the wind. They hesitated. Then, before either could react, the door slammed shut. Not drifted. Not swung gently. It slammed, as if an unseen force had pushed it closed from inside. That was the last anyone heard from them. At first, I told myself everything was fine. Maybe their radios had cut out. Maybe their phones had died. Maybe it was a long night, and they were just dealing with paperwork, too busy to check in. I scrolled through old messages, rereading the last text I had received. Quick call. Should be home soon. That was hours ago. I tried to shake the feeling creeping up my spine. It was ridiculous. I knew what I'd signed up for, being with someone in law enforcement. Long shifts, late nights. The silence of an empty apartment. The glow of the kitchen clock stretching across the floor. This was normal. This had to be normal. But it wasn't. Because when I finally gave in and called dispatch, the voice on the other end hesitated for just a second too long. Still out on a call, they said. A noise complaint shouldn't take this long. I sat there, staring at the wall, fingers clenched around my phone. Something gnawed at the edge of my thoughts, a quiet, persistent alarm that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with instinct. They should have been home by now. They weren't, and no one knew why. Morning arrived, but my partner did not. At first, I told myself they had just fallen asleep at the station, exhausted from a long shift. Maybe there had been more calls, more paperwork, more of the tedious, bureaucratic aftermath that always stretched the night longer than expected. But as the sun climbed higher, the excuses I made began to feel thinner, more desperate. Their phone remained silent. Every call went to voicemail. Every text sat unread. Then came the call from the department. Another unit was being sent to check on the house. That was when the cold certainty settled in my bones. I knew, without being told, that something was wrong. The second unit arrived at the old house just after 7 a.m. The sky was still gray, heavy with the weight of a morning that hadn't quite woken up yet. The grass, wet with lingering dew, crunched under their boots as they approached the house. The patrol car was still there, parked exactly where my partner had left it. The engine was cold. The doors were locked. Inside, the radio was still tuned to dispatch, static humming in the background, waiting for a response that would never come. They knocked, waited, knocked again. Nothing. They called out, voices firm but cautious, the way you speak when you don't know if you're calling into a home or a grave. No response. One of them peered through the window, but the curtains had been drawn. The house from the outside looked still, undisturbed, empty, but it wasn't. They forced their way inside. What they found was, at first, nothing. No overturned furniture, no signs of struggle, no footprints in the dust. Just the air, heavy and stagnant, carrying a faint metallic scent that clung to the walls, as if something had been left to rot and then scrubbed clean. Then they saw the uniforms. I don't remember driving to the house. One moment, I was home, pacing in restless circles, hands shaking as I redialed a number that would never connect. The next, I was standing outside that house, heart hammering against my ribs, staring up at the warped wooden panels and hollowed-out windows. Another officer tried to hold me back, murmuring reassurances that didn't reach my ears. I shoved past them. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been, considering the rising heat of the morning outside. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step somehow both too loud and too quiet. The living room was where I found them, or rather, what was left of them. Their uniforms lay in a heap on the wooden floor, ripped, torn in long, jagged slashes, as though something had peeled them away from the bodies underneath. The fabric was damp, the edges stiff with something that had dried overnight. There were no bodies, only bones. The realization came slowly, in layers. At first, it barely looked human, just pale, jagged remnants scattered across the floor. I told myself they had to be something else, anything else. Deer, maybe some kind of prank, an old Halloween decoration forgotten in the abandoned house. But then I saw the badge. It was lying in the center of it all, still pinned to a scrap of fabric that might have once been a chest pocket. It gleamed dully in the dim light, filtering through the dusty curtains. There was no blood, no message, no bodies, just the uniforms, the bones, and that awful metallic scent clinging to the walls. I turned, looking to the others, waiting for someone to say something, to explain this, to tell me I wasn't seeing what I was seeing. No one spoke. There were no answers, only silence, and that was worse than anything else. The house should have been empty. That was what we told ourselves as we stood there, staring at the pile of gnawed bones where our partners' bodies should have been. But then we saw the streaks, dark smears, dragged along the wooden floor, leading from the pile into the depths of the house. Not footprints, not blood, something heavier, thicker, like the ground itself had soaked in something it wasn't meant to hold. No one spoke. No one needed to. We followed. The streaks led us through a narrow hallway, past old furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. The air grew thick, damp, as if something had been breathing in this house long before we stepped inside. The wood groaned beneath our weight, but there was another sound beneath it, something faint like nails scratching from behind the walls. The streaks ended at a doorway that led deeper into the house. Beyond it, the darkness stretched unnaturally far, the corners swallowing the morning light that tried to seep in from the broken windows. The air smelled of rot. Not fresh, not like decay, but something older, something that had settled into the bones of this house long before we arrived. Then we saw the footprints. Bare, misshapen. They weren't human. They started at the edge of the hallway and led up the staircase, deep impressions in the dust, as if whatever left them had walked through here only moments before. Something was upstairs. The staircase was steep, the wood brittle beneath our feet. Dust swirled in the air, with every step thick enough to choke on. The second floor was wrong. There should have been light from the windows, but the hallway was dim, bathed in a sickly gray that made everything look washed out, lifeless. The air was heavier, pressing in on my skull, making each step forward feel like wading through something thick and unseen. Then we reached the master bedroom. The door was slightly open, barely enough to see inside. The footprints stopped here. We pushed inside. Bones. So many bones. They were piled near the window, small and pale, clean, picked free of flesh, brittle in places, almost too delicate to belong to any adult. Some were tiny, disturbingly thin, the size of a child's forearm. And at the top of the pile, half buried in the remains, lay another badge. My breath hitched. The number engraved on it was familiar. This wasn't just a grave. This was a feeding ground. The walls were scratched, the faded wallpaper torn away in deep, desperate gouges. Faint indentations littered the surface, letters carved in jagged, uneven lines, as if clawed in haste by hands that barely had the strength to finish. At first, the markings looked like nonsense, a collection of symbols and half-formed words. Then one of us whispered them aloud. The sound caught in my throat. It was a name. My name. The room tilted, the weight of recognition slamming into my skull like a hammer. I took a step back, eyes darting across the walls. More markings. More names. Every partner who had stepped into this house, every officer who had ever walked through that door. Their names were here, scratched into the walls, over and over, like a warning or a plea. And then I understood. The scratches weren't written. They weren't left as a message for the living. They were made from the inside. Someone had been trying to claw their way out. We needed to leave. The realization hit like a shock to the chest, shattering through the numb horror settling over us. The gnawed bones, the clawed names, the fresh footprints leading us deeper instead of out. The house was wrong, and it had been wrong long before we ever stepped inside. One of us turned and ran. The stairs creaked, the walls seemed closer than before, the air pressing down, thick and humid. The front door was there, just a few feet away, a clear path leading straight out into the gray morning light filtering through the windows. Hands slammed against the knob. It twisted freely, the old metal turning without resistance. But the door didn't open. Not locked, not stuck. It just wouldn't. The frame groaned, as though the wood itself had swollen to keep us inside. Fingernails dug into the edges, pulling, yanking, but the door did not move. It wasn't holding us in. The house was. A strangled breath, a glance back. The living room was darker than before. Not because of shadows, but because something about the air itself had thickened, as if light refused to fully reach inside. The space felt occupied, as though something unseen was breathing just beyond what our eyes could register. And then, movement. Not in the room, not on the floor, in the corner. A small, black shape, barely visible against the dust-covered wood. A camera. Someone had placed it high, out of reach, facing the entrance. It shouldn't have been there. The house had been abandoned for years. There were no homeowners, no security systems. And yet, the red light blinked, still recording. Fingers trembling, the buttons were pressed, the tiny screen flickered to life. Footage playback. The timestamp matched last night, the moment our partners had arrived. The image was grainy but clear, two officers stepping inside, their flashlights sweeping across the hollowed-out living room. They walked cautiously, radioing in. Nothing unusual. Then static, a harsh, grating distortion that crackled through the speakers. It lasted for minutes. Then a sound. Faint, vet, schlipping, like something being dragged through a narrow space. The footage cut to black. The officers were gone. No straged, no attack, no sign of what had taken them. Just empty space and the whisper of something shifting beyond the camera's reach. Then, from above, a groan. A deep, guttural exhale, dragging through the ceiling beams like something stirring after a long, restless sleep. The attic. Our bodies didn't want to move, but something else took over. The need for answers for anything that could make sense of the impossible. The ladder leading up was old, splintered. It resisted as it was pulled down, unfolding like something that hadn't been touched in decades. Each rung creaked under the weight of her steps. The attic was small. The air was damp, thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something sour. And in the center of it, waiting in the stillness, a chair. It wasn't just any chair. It was restrained. Thick leather straps curled around the armrests and legs, cinched tight, as though something had been tied down and left here to struggle. The wood was scratched. Deep, Jagged carvings dug into the surface. Marks of nails, of fingers, of something trying to escape. And in the left hand rest, a finger, still attached to the fragment of a hand, stiff and curled, the skin gray and shrunken. Clutched between its tips, wedged into the wood, was a pen. A police-issued pen, the kind our partners carried in their uniform pockets. Someone had used their last moments to write something. Carved into the back of the chair, in deep, uneven strokes. We became it. The attic breathed. The walls sighed. Something shifted deep within the house. And below us, on the first floor, footsteps began to move. The house was awake, not in the way of building groans in the wind or shifts under the weight of time, but in the way a thing with lungs inhales, in the way a presence not meant to be seen watches from places just outside your vision. We could feel it, and it fell us back. The first window should have shattered. A chair was heavy enough, the throw forceful enough, but instead of the sharp, satisfying sound of breaking glass, there was something else. The window flexed. Not cracked, not fractured. It stretched, distorting outward like the surface of water just before something rises to break it. The impact rippled, the glass bending, pulling back as if recoiling in pain. Then snapped back into place, unbroken. We tried again. Another window, then another. The house refused. The walls seemed to shift closer, their warped angles pressing inward, changing. The space between the doorways narrowed, the ceiling suddenly feeling just a little too low. The air had weight now, heavy and damp against the skin. Then came the noise. From above, from below, from inside the walls. It wasn't footsteps anymore. It was movement, a slow, wet shifting like something slithering just behind the rotting plaster. Something large, something waiting. We ran. The basement was the only place left. It shouldn't have been. Every instinct screamed that going deeper was the worst choice, that nothing good had ever come from a place that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. But the house had already made its decision. The basement door yawned open before we reached it, as if it had been waiting. A sharp descent. The stairs old, brittle. The air smelled thick, earth, damp and rotten. But there was something else. Something open. At the bottom of the stairs, beyond the foundation walls, was a tunnel. Not made from brick or concrete. Not part of the house. It was dug. The dirt was raw, the edges uneven, the passage wide enough for something to move through. The deeper it stretched, the less we could see. It was carved through the ground itself, leading somewhere far beneath the house. And in the silence, at the very edge of the dark, the dirt shifted. Footprints. Fresh. Emerging toward us. Not footprints from before. New ones. Something was coming up the tunnel. The walls breathed. The weight of the house pushed down. A sound, rising. Not a scream, not a growl, but something between the two. The realization came too late. The house wasn't keeping something out. It had been keeping something in, and now we were part of it. The last thing I remember was the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes, the feeling of something pressing against my skin without touching it. Then, nothing. They sent another unit. By the time they arrived, the house was quiet. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No bonus. No broken glass. Just 2 more patrol cars parked outside. Doors open. Engines cold. And from inside the house, if one stood long enough in the silence, a faint, wet scraping, like something inside the walls trying to get out.